They mocked her, attempted to discredit her, and are now begging for forgiveness. Karoline Leavitt had already seen challenging interviews and criticism, especially from liberal media, but this time it was different since it was a well-planned, direct attack rather than just a heated disagreement or political mocking. Her invitation to the talk program was presented as a policy discussion, but she noticed a shift in tone as soon as she sat down. Instead of the usual back and forth of conflicting opinions, the tension in the room felt more like an ambush. The initial inquiries were standard, predictable. Nevertheless, when one of the hosts suddenly leaned forward and spoke in a tone sharper than skepticism, the crowd instantly responded with gasps, whispers, and a few stifled giggles. Let's be honest, Karoline, your loyalty, rather than your qualifications, got you the job. Although Karoline's expression stayed the same, she could feel that she was the subject of a performance rather than an interview. Knowing that they wanted her to maintain her composure, she took a deep breath, slowly and calmly. If you disagree, let's talk about policy since I earned this place. Not insults, but instead of a policy, they anticipated a response. The other hosts grinned and glanced around the audience before administering the next blow that was earned or bestowed, because loyalty seems to be the only real qualification these days. Because the part had been arranged, the audience applauded. This time, and Karoline knew exactly what was going on. What she said was either misinterpreted, reframed, or ignored entirely. And the next several minutes were a blur of interruptions, mocking laughter, and leading questions designed to make her look incompetent. Rather than being used for conversation, the lines were rehearsed to humiliate. Karoline maintained her strength despite the show's emphasis on control over conversation. As the performance was nearing a close, the host hammered down on women, stating comments like, "You set us back, you're a pawn, and deep down, you know it." Silence, even the audience didn't know how to react to that one. She battled back with facts, stood up for herself, and didn't allow them to make her lose her temper. Karoline's jaw tensed, but not in an antagonistic manner. She gave me a slow, thoughtful smile, and I understood that they were attacking her out of fear more than because they agreed with what they were saying. At least I'm not a puppet, but if standing up for what I believe makes me a pawn, then so be it. When the segment concluded and the cameras cut, they thought the damage was done. By stealing the piece, portraying it as simply another divisive argument, and promoting their usual headlines, the network first tried to dominate the narrative, but was ill-prepared for the response that would ensue. In just a few hours, the video became popular online, showing up on YouTube, Twitter, and all conservative news sites. But when the complete, unedited version was made public, it painted an entirely different picture. Conservatives weren't just angry. They were incensed, and accusations of bullying, double standards, and media bias were common in the comment sections. No one who wasn't a giant fan of Karoline could refute what they had seen. Rather than engaging in a debate, they attacked her with widely shared hashtags such as Die, Die, Die and Karoline cancel the show. Republican lawmakers and conservative commentators attacked the exchange frame by frame, and even liberals who were uncomfortable with the host's excesses agreed that it was not a good appearance. But it didn't stop there. Not only were fans furious, but they also started to be strategic in their criticism of the show's sponsors, asking them why they were funding a platform that openly denigrated women who didn't agree with them. Some companies tried to ignore it, others declared in broad strokes. But when one of the biggest sponsors pulled their statement, which had been carefully worded to minimize controversy and make it clear they would rather not be associated with contentious and unprofessional discussion, the network immediately went into damage control mode. Anonymous sources circulated reports of fear. The hosts of the show were silent at first until they made a closing statement about contentious arguments and opposing views, but it was too late. The management behind the scenes held frantic meetings to discuss how to regain control and sought explanations. Karoline was not yet required to speak in public, because signs of something more dangerous were now present. There were rumors that she was preparing to sue for professional injury, targeted harassment, and potentially even organized media misbehavior. The network had faced criticism before and had weathered the storm, but this time it was different. Karoline sat in a dark office in Washington, D.C., because signs of something more dangerous were now present. There were rumors that she was preparing to sue for professional injury, targeted harassment, and potentially even organized media misbehavior. The network had faced criticism before and had weathered the storm, but this time it was different. Karoline sat in a dark office in Washington, D.C., across from her attorney. The table was covered with stacks of papers, some of which were still warm from the printer. It was clear that this was about responsibility rather than merely a political dispute or a moment that went viral. An experienced attorney with years of experience in media litigation set down her pen and reclined. The defamation argument is strong, but since this was an intentional attempt to discredit you rather than just criticism, we can also argue that you incurred professional harm. Karoline was not the kind to go straight into legal issues, so she listened carefully. But this time it was about her feelings and a precedent, and the more they looked into it, the worse it got. Particularly noteworthy was the remark, "Make sure she stumbles and cut her off if she gets too comfortable." The following morning's news showed that the part had been pre-planned as an exposure piece rather than a genuine interview, exposing that this was an ambush rather than journalism. Karoline Leavitt was officially pursuing legal action. Although the network's counsel rushed to issue remarks denouncing the case as futile and a last-ditch political attempt, the damage had already started to spread because it now concerned media, ethics, and how particular voices were talked about in national forums. The same notion started to cross the minds of viewers on both sides of the aisle. Why were they rushing if they had nothing to hide? Then a former producer appeared out of nowhere. As additional advertisers withdrew, the outcry intensified and the show's ratings declined. She initially talked anonymously in an exclusive interview before disclosing what many had surmised. The show has a track record of planning attacks against conservative guests. In addition to directing the edit, producers were instructed to put them in embarrassing circumstances, interrupt them, and subtly mock them. She provided emails to back up this assertion. Memoranda and even uncut footage from earlier interviews demonstrated that Karoline's experience was not an accident, but rather a normal part of the process. This was suddenly an expose, not simply a lawsuit, and the network had no idea how to sell it. The network's headquarters had a stifling environment. Executives used barking to give orders. As legal teams gathered around conference tables, PR specialists worked feverishly to write the perfect damage control statement. They had dealt with controversies in the past, but this was a serious issue, not simply another bad press cycle. The former producer's testimony, the emails that were made public, and the removal of adverts and Karoline's lawsuit was now moving more quickly. The network made an official statement, but it didn't work. "We apologize for any confusion, but we insist that our hosts behaved in a way that was consistent with spirited discussion." The situation was made worse by the fact that viewers saw right through the well-crafted non-apology. The show's social media pages were in ruins by the next morning, with dislikes soaring, comments disabled, and more advertisers breaking off ties while vaguely claiming to be re-evaluating partnerships. The clear evidence that corporate sponsors didn't want the heat was followed by the first major internal casualty. Insiders disclosed that a significant producer of the show had resigned, despite the press release claiming that the decision was mutual. Even though they were trying to put out the fire, the legal procedure had already begun. Therefore, it was too late. Karoline's team asked for internal papers to find more proof of coordinated media bias and targeted slander, and they found something more detrimental than they had expected. Additional emails, memoranda, and unquestionable proof that the network was not only covering news but actively influencing it surfaced. Then, in the most shocking development of all, another former employee came out, revealing the network as a whole rather than just the talk show. The network was forced to face the horrifying realization that they were fighting the truth, not only Karoline, as the court struggle grew more intense. They asserted that this was not a singular instance. When certain visitors were deliberately discredited, silenced, and mocked to support a preconceived narrative, suddenly the integrity of the entire media organization was at stake in Karoline's case, not just hers. Every seat in the courtroom was packed with reporters who were prepared to document every moment with cameras and notebooks. Outside, supporters and protesters were queuing up for blocks in media cars, making the scene even more chaotic. This lawsuit is no longer just a legal one, it has become a cultural one. Karoline sat by her lawyers, composed but focused. She had been preparing for this for weeks, and while the network's legal staff was formidable, she was aware that they were fighting not just her, but also their mistakes from the past. The trial began with the opening arguments. Political issues are not at the core of this problem, Karoline's lawyers made clear. It has to do with media accountability. Our client was picked out and discredited by purposeful misrepresentation instead of honest journalism. Then came the evidence, which showed a clear pattern of concerted bias in hacked emails, producer testimony, and unedited video from previous interviews. Producers were given pre-show instructions to ensure conservative guests never came out looking strong. The former producer testified under oath. Every piece tightened the network's noose, despite their defense team's attempts to claim that Karoline was merely playing the victim and that passionate argument was common. When she read aloud one particular email, the courtroom suddenly went silent. Don't let her finish sentences. Keep your cool. Make light of her. Undermine her credibility. Any chance that the interview had been fair was dashed by that one line. The network's lawyers responded by calling the show's format entertainment, not in the news. They argued that guests should expect difficult inquiries, but Karoline's attorneys returned with a stronger defense. A video montage of courteous interviews on one side starkly contrasted how liberal and conservative guests were treated. Unbroken answers and softball inquiries. The more frequent interruptions, as cheap insults, sarcasm, and ridiculing were used as arguments, the jury silently watched the obvious contrast. The financial records followed. Karoline's team supplied data showing the measurable damage to her reputation, cancelled speeches. As closing statements came to a close, the jury was left with only one question to consider. Did the network go too far? The case had evolved from a media controversy to a reckoning. The whole country waited for the decision. At that time, opportunities were taken away, and a deliberate effort was made to silence her. The jury's decision came sooner than expected, and as the judge reappeared in the courtroom, everyone held their breath. Once self-assured, the four members of the network's legal team seemed worn out as Karoline sat still, her hands folded across her lap. In the matter of professional injury and slander, the jury found in favor of the plaintiff. Karoline Leavitt makes a few startled looks and gasps. Karoline closed her eyes and exhaled sharply as the weight of the past few months finally lifted. There was a public acknowledgement of fault, a multi-million-dollar settlement was negotiated, and the losses were significant. The network issued a formal apology to Karoline and all other guests who had been the targets of their techniques, but the consequences were far-reaching. More employees came out after the show was formally cancelled, and the network feigned a reorganization decision, but everyone knew the truth that the brand was too toxic for advertisers to return. After more unethical tactics were exposed, Karoline's career not only survived but thrived. It was a watershed moment for political journalism, and she became a symbol of defying media manipulation. Despite having a greater platform, more speaking engagements, and more book sales than ever before, she refrained from bragging. "It's not about silencing people you disagree with, it's about accountability," she said as she departed from the public eye. Reporting reality is what the media are meant to do, not creating it. Share this story and start a conversation about the media if it made you think. Both responsibility and bias remain. Make sure that people hear you. Enroll in stories that are more narratively demanding, because the truth always comes to light.